Lady Isabel Harrington was 20 years old when the season of 1812 rose in its glittering promise, and in those early weeks she moved through London as though the world had been painted in her favour. She was the daughter of Viscount Harrington, once a man of considerable influence, though his fortunes had diminished after years of poor harvests and unwise ventures. Their townhouse, situated on a respectable but not fashionable street, carried the dignity of former wealth, its panelling polished, its furniture well kept, though none of it new. Isabel had grown up with the consciousness that appearances could not be neglected, for appearances were often all that remained to preserve one's place in society. She was not the sort of young woman who dazzled instantly in a crowded room. Her beauty was of a quieter kind, discovered gradually in the refinement of her features, in the composure of her bearing, and in the intelligence that shone whenever she spoke. She had been educated at home, her mind nourished by her father's library and her mother's insistence on accomplishments. She could play the pianoforte with delicacy, draw the outlines of a landscape with sure hand, and converse on subjects far beyond the usual chatter of gowns and weather. Yet it was her serenity, that unhurried calm she carried with her, which drew eyes toward her even when she wished to remain unseen. Society had taken notice. That season, invitations arrived more readily than in years past, and Isabel found herself in the company of young men whose attentions, though flattering, left her heart unmoved. She had been raised to understand that marriage was not a matter of passion, but of prudence, that her family's position depended on her ability to secure an advantageous match. Still, she had secretly hoped to find both safety and affection, not merely duty. It seemed that hope was not to be in vain, for Count Edward Ashford had appeared in her path. Edward was the only son of Earl Ashford, heir to vast estates, and bearer of a title that carried weight in every circle. He was known not merely for his rank, but for the character he displayed in public. His manners were courteous without stiffness, his conversation lively without indiscretion, and his presence commanding without arrogance. Where many young men of his position cultivated a careless indifference, Edward was attentive, deliberate, and unmistakably sincere in his engagements. Isabel had first encountered him at Almack's, where the crowded assembly had left her feeling diminished in a sea of brighter beauties. Yet Edward had noticed her, had asked her to dance, and had spoken with a gentleness that drew her out of her reserve. From that evening onward, their paths seemed destined to cross. At soirée, he sought her out for conversation. During rides in Hyde Park, he slowed his horse to match her family's carriage, his eyes attentive only to her. At smaller gatherings, they had shared moments of quiet intimacy, the kind permitted by glances, by brief touches of the hand, by words that carried more meaning than their surface suggested. Once, in the shaded corner of a garden party, he had spoken words that burned themselves into her memory, that he valued honesty above all things, and that he could never give his heart where affection was absent. Isabel believed him. She believed him when he lingered near her while others clamored for his notice. She believed him when he asked her opinion on matters of art and poetry, as though her thoughts carried weight beyond polite amusement. She believed him when his eyes followed her across a room, steady and unashamed. And though no official declaration had been made, though no ring had been placed upon her finger, Isabel allowed herself to feel secure in the conviction that her future would be bound to his. Her parents encouraged her quiet confidence. Though cautious, they saw the Count's attentions as a sign of serious intent. For the Harringtons, whose resources had dwindled, such a union would mean restoration to the circles of power they had once enjoyed. For Isabel, it would mean a life beside a man she admired, and, though she scarcely admitted it even to herself, a man she loved. It was with this certainty that she dressed on the evening of the Ashford ball. The invitation had been regarded as an honor by all who received it, for the Ashfords seldom opened their house on such a scale. The occasion was rumored to be significant, though no one would say precisely why. Isabel, her heart buoyed by secret anticipation, could not help but wonder whether the night might bring the announcement she had been longing to hear. Her maid fastened the pale blue gown that had been carefully chosen, a color that flattered her complexion, and lent her an air of quiet distinction. A single string of pearls adorned her neck, modest yet elegant, while her hair, arranged with precision, framed her features without ostentation. Her mother, observing her with satisfaction, remarked that she looked every inch a lady prepared to take her place in the world. Isabel smiled, though inwardly her heart raced. She told herself to remain composed, to accept whatever came with grace, yet hope fluttered within her despite every caution. As the carriage conveyed them through the lamplit streets, she gazed out at the city alive with movement, each turning wheel and flickering torch carrying her closer to the moment she believed would change her life. The Ashford residence stood ablaze with light, its grand facade adorned with festoons and lanterns that made it visible from far along the street. Carriages lined the square, their occupants descending in silks and jewels, while footmen hurried to and fro with measured precision. Isabel stepped out upon the gravel, her slippered feet sinking slightly, as she lifted her gaze to the house that seemed almost to glow against the night. Music already floated from within, the strains of violins carried through the open doors, mingled with laughter and the rustle of gowns. Inside, the splendor overwhelmed even her prepared imagination. Chandeliers spilled golden light across mirrored walls, their brilliance reflected 100 times until the very air seemed to shimmer. The scent of roses and wax mingled with perfume, and the hum of voices rose and fell like a tide. Isabel's hand rested lightly upon her father's arm as they made their way through the throng, pausing to exchange greetings with acquaintances, each word of politeness concealing the undercurrent of speculation that always accompanied her presence. Her eyes searched, almost against her will, for one figure among the many. She saw him at last near the head of the room, tall, his dark hair catching the light, his manner as assured as ever. Edward stood surrounded by gentlemen of rank and ladies who pressed eagerly for his notice. Yet, as if drawn by the invisible thread that had always seemed to bind them, his gaze lifted across the crowd and met hers. For a moment, the noise of the hall receded. Isabel felt her breath catch, her heart leap in recognition. There was nothing hurried or careless in that look. It was steady, purposeful, as though the press of obligations around him were of no importance compared with the simple fact of her presence. Encouraged, she allowed herself to imagine that this was the night he would speak not only to her, but to all assembled. Perhaps he would confirm before witnesses what her heart already knew. The possibility filled her with a trembling anticipation, half fear, half joy. She tried to school her expression into calm composure, though the warmth in her cheeks betrayed the depth of her feelings. The music swelled, and dancers filled the floor, their gowns and coats a whirl of color beneath the chandeliers. Isabel took her place among acquaintances, her eyes straying constantly toward Edward. He seemed restless, though concealed beneath his habitual grace, as if preparing himself for some weighty act. At intervals he spoke quietly with his father, who nodded with grave satisfaction. Then Edward stepped forward, mounting the slight dais at the head of the room. The musicians softened, the dancers paused, and an expectant hush spread through the hall. All eyes turned toward him, waiting for his words. And in that suspended moment, with her heart suspended too, Isabel felt the breath of fate upon her, knowing that whatever he was about to say would alter the course of her life forever. The silence in the ballroom was profound, as though even the air itself hesitated. Count Edward Ashford stood poised upon the dais, his tall figure illuminated by the blaze of chandeliers above. Every gaze fixed upon him, every whisper stilled, and in that stillness, Lady Isabel Harrington's heart beat with such force she could hear nothing else. She had imagined this moment many times, imagined his words shaped into the promise she longed to hear. Her gloved hands clasped tightly together, breath caught, eyes fixed upon him with all the fragile hope of her soul. Edward's expression was composed, though his lips pressed together before he began. His gaze moved deliberately across the hall, resting first on his father, then on the assembled nobility, and finally, only for the briefest instant, upon Isabel. In that fleeting look, her chest filled with anticipation, convinced she understood what was to come. Yet when he began to speak, the words that fell from his lips struck like cold iron against her heart. He announced, with measured clarity, his engagement to Lady Charlotte Pembroke, daughter of the Duke of Pembroke. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly rising into applause. Fans fluttered, gentlemen clapped shoulders, and the rustle of silks accompanied exclamations of delight. The union was praised instantly for its brilliance. Two great houses bound together, the Pembrokes with their immense political influence, the Ashfords with their lineage and wealth. It was, everyone said, the most natural and advantageous match of the season. Isabel stood motionless, her body rigid though her mind reeled. The name resounded in her ears like the tolling of a bell. Lady Charlotte. She saw her then, standing with serene composure at the far side of the hall, her beauty framed in a gown of ivory silk that glimmered beneath the light. Charlotte's chin lifted, her eyes gleaming with triumph, even as her lips arranged themselves into a modest smile. Isabel's stomach turned, for in that look she understood that Charlotte was fully aware of what this announcement meant for her. The applause swelled, filling the chamber with thunderous approval. Isabel felt it like a storm pressing upon her chest, suffocating her. She struggled to draw breath, to maintain the mask of civility required in such a place. The corners of her mouth lifted in the faintest semblance of composure, though her cheeks burned with shame. Around her, the company's glances shifted. Some looked at her with pity, others with thinly concealed amusement, their whispers carried behind fluttering fans. She knew what they were saying. They were remarking on how often the Count had stood by her side, how their conversations had lingered longer than propriety allowed, how her name had been joined with his in speculative tones only weeks before. Now, with his engagement announced to another, those speculations became ridicule. She could feel the judgment of 100 eyes pressing upon her, as though she were a character in a cruel play designed for their entertainment. Edward continued to speak, his tone steady, praising the union as one that honored both families and promised strength for the future. His words were measured, chosen with care, but Isabel heard nothing of them. She saw only his face, and in the faint tightening of his jaw, in the fleeting shadow that crossed his eyes, she detected something unspoken. He did not look the part of a man exultant in triumph. To her he seemed bound by chains invisible to all but herself. Yet what did it matter? The words had been spoken before witnesses, the engagement declared. No private look, no secret remembrance could erase the truth now. Isabel's chest ached with a sharpness that stole her breath, as though her very heart had been struck. She fought to steady her trembling hands, clenching them against the folds of her gown, willing herself not to collapse under the weight of humiliation. The music began again, violins lifting into a lively strain, as though the room itself celebrated the announcement. Couples moved toward the floor, laughter and voices rising once more. Edward descended from the dais, moving to stand beside Charlotte, who received him with a gracious inclination of her head. The two appeared as society wished them to appear, a perfect pair, destined for grandeur. Applause followed them as they stepped forward, as though the world itself applauded the severing of Isabel's hopes. She stood rooted in place, each passing moment a torment. The friends beside her shifted uncomfortably, their attempts at polite conversation faltering under the weight of what hung unspoken between them. Isabel forced a smile, forced words of agreement to pass her lips when someone remarked upon the brilliance of the match. Yet each syllable scraped her throat like glass. Her pulse throbbed at her temples, her vision blurred, and her only thought was of escape. She turned her gaze toward Edward once more, and in that instant he looked back at her. His eyes, dark and conflicted, met hers across the glittering throng. For one heartbeat, the noise around them faded, the laughter and music receding until there was only the silent, desperate recognition between them. Then Charlotte touched his arm, and his attention shifted. The connection broke like a thread snapped in two, leaving Isabel adrift. Her breath caught, sharp and shallow. The walls seemed to close around her, the air heavy with perfume and heat, Every whisper, every glance pressed upon her with crushing force. She felt herself trembling, scarcely able to stand, her dignity slipping from her grasp. And before the next dance began, she turned quickly, making her way toward the shadows of the gallery above, her heart pounding with every step. But even as she slipped into the narrow stairway, away from the gaze of the crowd, she knew she was not free of it. For though the voices behind her swelled in celebration, one glance from Edward lingered in her mind, leaving her uncertain whether it had been a final farewell or a silent cry bound by chains she could not yet see. The gallery above the ballroom was dimmer, its long windows casting pale reflections of candlelight from the glittering hall below. The air was cooler there, tinged with the faint scent of wax and roses carried upward from the festivities. Isabel sank onto a carved bench beneath one of the tall windows, her gloved hands pressed against her face. The rustle of gowns, the laughter, and the triumphant music below rose faintly through the open archway, each note piercing her heart like a reminder of the world she had just fled. She tried to quiet her breath, but the sobs came despite her effort. The satin of her gown darkened where her tears fell, dampening the delicate fabric as she leaned forward. She had never wept so openly, not even in childhood. The humiliation was too sharp, too overwhelming. It burned against her skin, leaving her flushed with both shame and grief. Her mind replayed the moment with cruel precision. Edward's steady voice as he named another woman, the thunderous applause that followed, Charlotte's composed, victorious smile, and most unbearable of all, the whispers that had circled around Isabel as though she were the evening's entertainment. Their meaning had been unmistakable. She had been a fool, a naive girl, who believed in promises made in gardens and glances stolen beneath chandeliers. She thought of the nights when Edward's hand had brushed hers, of the words he had spoken about truth and affection, and of the look he had given her in that same hall only moments before his betrayal. Each memory returned now like a torment, stripped of its sweetness, twisted into mockery by the announcement he had made. The very moments she had cherished became evidence of her blindness. How could she have trusted him? How could she have allowed her heart to build so much upon gestures that had never been secured by vows? Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. She pressed her hand against the pearls at her throat as though they choked her. The soft string, once a gift from her mother, now felt like a chain. The thought that society would speak of her pityingly, perhaps even cruelly, gnawed at her. By tomorrow, her name would be joined with laughter in drawing rooms across London. She would be the lady who thought herself chosen, only to be set aside for a greater prize. The sting of it forced fresh tears to her eyes. To be discarded was misery enough. To be made spectacle was unbearable. She longed for the privacy of her chamber, where at least her sorrow might be endured without an audience. Yet even there, she knew, whispers would follow. Servants heard everything, and rumors spread faster than wildfire in houses where gossip was a form of currency. Isabel stood and walked toward the railing of the gallery, her hands tightening on the polished wood as she looked down at the scene below. The dancers twirled gracefully, their jewels flashing in the light. The music swelled, lively and triumphant, as though mocking her pain. She spotted Edward easily, tall among the crowd, moving with Charlotte at his side. He smiled when she spoke to him, but his smile seemed strained, as though fixed by force of will. Still, no one else appeared to notice, or if they did, they chose not to remark. To them he was the picture of duty fulfilled and alliance secured. Her vision blurred again, tears gathering until the brilliant figures below shimmered like illusions in a dream. She turned away sharply, unable to bear the sight. Leaning back against the cool wall, she pressed her hand against her mouth, stifling the sound of her sobs. Her gown clung to her knees as she sank once more onto the bench, body trembling with exhaustion and despair. Every sound from the ballroom below was a cruel reminder of the life she had believed hers. The rustle of gowns reminded her of the dances they had shared. The laughter recalled conversations that had seemed filled with promise. The music echoed the unspoken vows she thought had been woven between them. Now each note seemed to laugh at her, exposing her folly. She longed for silence, for stillness, for release from the relentless noise of celebration. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her temples, trying to block it out. In that darkness, Edward's face came unbidden, his eyes filled with the same conflict she had seen in them when he looked at her across the hall. The memory of that look would not fade. It lingered, insistent, as though it carried meaning she could not yet grasp. Her tears slowed at last, though her body still shook with the aftermath of grief. The fire of humiliation remained, a constant ache that settled deep in her chest. She sat in silence, her breath shallow, her thoughts tumbling one over another. She wondered if she could ever endure the glances of her acquaintances again, or the whispered conversations that would surely swell in the days to come. The faint creak of a door reached her ears then, breaking through her thoughts. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Soft footsteps echoed against the gallery floor, approaching with unhurried rhythm. Isabel straightened quickly, wiping her cheeks with the edge of her glove, desperate to erase the evidence of her tears before anyone should see. She turned toward the sound, her breath caught in dread, uncertain whether the figure approaching would be a friend or a witness to her shame. It was Lady Margaret who appeared in the gallery, her step measured, her posture erect despite the heaviness of years. She had always been a figure of calm authority in Isabel's life, a woman who never permitted sentiment to weaken her composure before the world. The soft lamplight caught the streaks of silver in her hair, framing a face lined not only by time, but by endurance. She advanced without hesitation, as though she had expected to find Isabel precisely where she was. "Child," she said quietly, though her tone carried no pity. She lowered herself onto the bench beside her niece, her gown settling into graceful folds. Isabel tried to turn her face away, ashamed of the traces of tears still glistening on her cheeks. Margaret, however, took one of Isabel's hands firmly in her own, the gesture both grounding and commanding. "There is no shame in sorrow," Margaret continued after a pause, her eyes fixed ahead rather than on Isabel, "but there is great danger in surrendering to it." The words fell with the weight of experience, not reproach. Isabel's throat tightened, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound emerged. The music below drifted upward, the lively strains mocking Isabel's despair. Yet Margaret seemed untouched by it, as though the noise of the world had never held power over her. She sat in perfect composure, her shoulders drawn back, her chin lifted slightly, her hand steady upon Isabel's trembling fingers. "I was once as you are now," Margaret said at last, her voice calm, her gaze unflinching. "There was a time when I, too, believed myself promised by a gentleman's words, when I trusted glances and gestures as though they were vows. The match was broken. The whispers were cruel. For a season I thought myself ruined." She allowed the memory to hang in the silence, the weight of it heavy between them. Isabel turned toward her, startled. Margaret rarely spoke of her own past, preferring to let others believe her heart had never been stirred. The revelation unsettled Isabel's grief, drawing her attention away from herself. "And what did you do?" she whispered, her voice uneven. "I endured," Margaret replied simply. "I held my head high when others sought to see me diminished. I discovered that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. And when the world found no amusement in my downfall, it turned its gaze elsewhere. It always does." She tightened her hold on Isabel's hand. "That is what you must remember tonight. You may weep in private, but when you return to them, you will not give them the pleasure of seeing you broken." The firmness of the words cut through Isabel's haze of despair. She drew a shaking breath, her tears no longer falling so freely. The thought that another had endured such humiliation, and survived it, offered her a fragile thread of strength. Perhaps it was possible to rise above the cruelty of whispers, to remain upright even as her heart faltered. Yet Isabel's voice trembled when she asked, "But what of the heart, Aunt?" How does one endure when the very center of life feels torn away? Margaret's eyes softened briefly, though her composure never wavered. The heart learns its own endurance, she said. Time teaches it what society cannot. And often, what feels like the end of all things is but the beginning of another path. You cannot see it tonight, but you will. The words sank into Isabel's spirit, not with sudden comfort, but with a slow, steadying weight. She pressed her free hand against her gown, feeling the tremors within her body begin to ease. Her aunt's strength, so unyielding, seemed to lend her a measure of her own. The humiliation remained sharp, the grief still raw, but beneath them stirred the faintest spark of defiance. Margaret rose then, drawing Isabel up with her. You cannot remain here, she said. If you do, tongues will guess at your distress. We will return together. You will walk at my side, and no one shall see anything but composure in you. They will wonder perhaps what you think, but they will not know. That, my dear, is power. Isabel swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the polished floor, gathering her courage. She allowed her aunt to guide her toward the archway, the hum of voices from the ballroom growing louder with each step. Her pulse quickened, fear tightening in her chest at the thought of re-entering that glittering hall where all had witnessed her humiliation. As they reached the threshold, Isabel lifted her head, her features carefully arranged, her tears hidden, her arms steady upon her aunt's. Yet even as she prepared to face the crowd once more, her eyes strayed across the room and met Edward's gaze, fixed upon her with an intensity that threatened to unravel all the fragile strength she had just gathered. The journey to the countryside was made without ceremony. Isabel did not resist when her parents proposed that she should spend some weeks at their estate away from the endless murmur of the city. She longed for escape, for a place where the constant weight of curious eyes and whispered speculation could not follow her. The coach that bore her away from London moved steadily along the rutted roads, carrying her father with each turn of the wheel from the glittering houses where she had suffered her disgrace. The landscape gradually softened as the city receded. Brick and stone gave way to hedgerows and fields, touched with the early green of spring. The air, no longer thick with the soot and clamour of London, carried the freshness of earth after rain. Isabel leaned her forehead against the glass of the carriage window, her reflection pale against the countryside sweeping by. The silence of the journey gave her ample space for thought, though the thoughts themselves brought little comfort. At last, the familiar sight of the Harrington estate came into view. The house was not grand, its walls softened by ivy, its gardens modest but lovingly kept. For Isabel, it had always been a place of quiet refuge, a home unadorned by ostentation. She stepped down from the carriage and breathed deeply of the cool air, the scent of damp soil and budding blossoms surrounding her. It was a contrast so stark to the perfumed brilliance of London that it made her chest ache with relief. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness foreign to her recent life. She rose to the sound of birds rather than carriage wheels, walked beneath trees whose branches whispered with the wind instead of gossip, and sat in the garden with books that did not judge her. The humiliation still lingered within her heart, raw and unhealed, but here the edges dulled, softened by the rhythms of the countryside. She spent hours sketching the orchard in her journal, her pencil tracing the outlines of branches heavy with promise of bloom, as though by capturing them she might steady herself. Letters arrived from the city, brought by the steady hand of the local postman. They confirmed what Isabel already suspected. Edward's engagement to Lady Charlotte had become the triumph of the season, lauded in every circle. The names of the Ashfords and the Pembrokes were joined with satisfaction in every drawing room. Yet her own name was not forgotten. The letters carried whispers of speculation, of sly remarks delivered in company, of laughter that followed her absence. She was painted as the young lady who had presumed too much, whose hopes had been dashed by a man with greater ambitions. Each line pierced her, yet she read them all, unwilling to shield herself from the truth of how society saw her. The hurt remained, but in the solitude of her walks, Isabel began to think beyond it. She considered what she truly desired, not merely what was expected of her. The taste of freedom, though mingled with sorrow, stirred something long dormant within her. Perhaps she did not wish to return to the endless parade of assemblies and suppers, where every glance was weighed and every gesture catalogued. Perhaps, she thought, there might be another path, though its outline was still uncertain. One afternoon she sat beneath the shade of an oak tree at the edge of the orchard, her journal open upon her knees. The light fell dappled across the page, where she had drawn the curve of a branch bending toward the earth. The distant sound of hooves carried across the stillness, faint at first, then steadily nearer. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a figure on horseback approaching along the drive. The rider dismounted before the house, handing the reins to a servant. The cut of his coat, though travel-worn, was unmistakable, and the urgency of his stride left no doubt as to his purpose. Isabel's heart clenched as she recognized him. It was Edward, his expression grave, his eyes fixed not on the house, but searching the garden. She remained frozen beneath the oak, her hand pressed against her journal, scarcely able to breathe as the man she had fled now came to stand before her once more. Edward's figure grew distinct against the pale light of the afternoon, his coat marked with dust from the road, his gloves worn from the reins. His steps were not hurried, yet they carried a weight that spoke of decision. Isabel remained still beneath the oak tree, the journal open in her lap, her pencil lying forgotten upon the page. Her heart raced with such force that she feared he might hear it across the quiet of the garden. When he reached her, he removed his hat, his dark hair stirred by the breeze. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the words unsaid, all the questions that had haunted Isabel's nights. She felt the sting of betrayal rise anew, but beneath it was the undeniable pull of the man who now stood before her. He bowed slightly, his voice low when he at last spoke. "Lady Isabel." The formality struck her like a barrier, though she heard beneath it a tremor that betrayed the strain of his composure. He did not attempt to disguise his purpose with pleasantries. Instead, he confessed in plain words that his engagement to Lady Charlotte had not been chosen by him. His family, bound by debts and ambition, had pressed the alliance upon him with an insistence he could not resist. He said that his heart had not altered, that it remained steadfast where it had always been. Isabel listened, her eyes fixed upon him, her breath shallow. A storm rose within her, part longing, part indignation. His words were those she had once yearned to hear, yet they came after her public disgrace, after he had stood before 100 witnesses and pledged himself to another. She felt her hand tremble against the cover of her journal, the weight of memory and present grief colliding within her. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. She told him that words spoken in shadows were powerless when silence ruled in the light. She reminded him that she had endured the sting of whispers, the humiliation of being made spectacle, while he had stood beside another. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, held his as she declared she would not accept the place of a hidden attachment. Edward's expression tightened, his jaw set, but his gaze did not waver. He reached as though to take her hand, to press upon her the sincerity of his heart. Yet she drew back swiftly, her fingers closing over the journal, as though it were a shield. The distance between them was more than the space of a step. It was the weight of her pride, the memory of betrayal, the defiance that her aunt's words had planted within her. Still, Edward did not retreat. His voice deepened, carrying urgency. He vowed that he would not allow their story to end in silence, that he would not rest content beneath the chains his family sought to impose. He spoke not with the triumph of a man secure in his choices, but with the desperation of one fighting against them. Isabel's breath quickened, her resolve faltering beneath the intensity of his words. Yet she gathered her strength, steadying her voice to remind him that vows unkept are worse than no vows at all. She told him that his declaration meant nothing so long as he stood promise to another before the eyes of society. The ache in her chest sharpened as she spoke, but she did not falter. For a long moment, silence stretched between them once more, broken only by the rustle of the orchard leaves and the distant call of a bird across the fields. Edward's shoulders rose with a slow breath, his gaze dark with determination, as though he would have spoken further. But before the words could leave his lips, the sound of footsteps approached from the house. Lady Margaret appeared at the garden path, her presence as unyielding as stone, her eyes sharp as they fell upon Edward. Isabel turned toward her aunt instinctively, her chest still heaving with the force of what had passed, uncertain what storm her aunt's arrival might now bring. London received Isabel again with the brilliance she had dreaded. The city stirred with restless talk, its drawing rooms alive with curiosity, its corridors humming with rumor. Though she had cherished the quiet of the countryside, she could not refuse her family's summons to return. The excuse was obligation. The Ashfords and Pembrokes were to host a supper in anticipation of the marriage, and absence would be more noticed than presence. Reluctance offered no shield. The carriage bore her once more into the heart of the society that had scorned her. The evening of the supper arrived with a cruel swiftness. Isabel dressed with deliberate composure, choosing a gown of soft grey silk that bore no pretense of rivalry. Pearls adorned her neck, their pale luster a reminder of her aunt's counsel. Dignity must not be surrendered. When she entered the hall of the Pembroke house, her chin lifted with quiet strength, though her heart thrummed against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room glowed with candelabra, the scent of hot dishes mingling with perfumes and the sweet smoke of tapers. Nobility filled the tables, their laughter a harmony of false ease. Isabel felt eyes turn toward her as she moved through the crowd, guided by her aunt's steady arm. Some bowed politely, others offered greetings too warm to be sincere, and still others looked past her entirely, as though her existence was a discomfort. Every gesture confirmed what she had feared. She had become an object of scrutiny. At the head of the room stood Lady Charlotte, dressed in pale lavender, her jewels chosen with precision to dazzle but not offend. She welcomed Isabel with a smile as polished as glass. Her voice carried the courtesy of triumph, her phrases smooth, her composure perfect. Yet beneath each word was the sharp edge of possession. Charlotte's glance lingered a moment too long, her smile a fraction too sweet, making it clear that she considered Isabel defeated. Isabel inclined her head in return, her expression calm, her voice measured. She allowed no sign of hurt to escape, no tremor to betray her. Beneath her stillness, though, her spirit seethed. The memory of Edward's confession in the orchard pressed against her heart, threatening to break the mask she wore. She held it firmly in place, reminding herself of her aunt's counsel. Composure was power. The supper began, each course presented with ceremony, the table glittering with silver and crystal. Conversation swirled around Isabel, her name spoken in tones too low to be admitted, but too near to ignore. She caught fragments, references to entanglements, to misunderstandings, to attachments ill-advised. The words stung, yet she forced herself to sit in silence, her back straight, her smile serene. Across the table sat Edward, his gaze restless, though he concealed it behind the gestures of politeness. When others spoke, he responded with courtesy, but his eyes drifted toward Isabel with a persistence that did not go unnoticed. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring behind raised hands, watching the glances that passed between them. Whispers began to spread, as swift and poisonous as ivy climbing a wall. By the time the final course was cleared, the hall thrummed with speculation. The union that had been meant to symbolize unassailable strength now bore the cracks of tension. Charlotte's hand rested upon Edward's arm with visible firmness, as though to assert her claim before all. The Duke, stern in his seat, cast glances that silenced those nearest him. Yet the whispers did not cease. Isabel felt them pressing against her like a rising tide. She knew her reputation balanced on the edge of another scandal. If she faltered, if she revealed the depth of her turmoil, she would be undone completely. She fixed her eyes upon the candle before her, its flame steady in the draught, and willed herself to hold as firm. But as the guests began to rise from the table, preparing for the next stage of the evening, a servant entered with an air of urgency. He bent low to the Duke, his whisper too faint for others to hear. The Duke's face darkened, his jaw set with anger, and his gaze moved deliberately across the company until it settled upon Isabel. The hall quieted as the Duke's gaze fixed on Isabel. Though no words were spoken, the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. A hush spread through the company, the rustle of silk and the clink of glass fading into silence. Isabel felt the weight of 100 eyes upon her, sharp and unrelenting. Her pulse throbbed in her throat, but she did not lower her head. She had endured this before, and she would endure it again. Edward rose slowly from his seat, his chair scraping against the polished floor. The sound echoed through the hall, startling in its defiance. He stood tall, his features pale yet resolute, and with deliberate steps he moved toward the center of the room. His father's voice called his name sharply, but Edward did not pause. The murmurs rose in a wave, swelling as though the crowd itself sensed that something was about to rupture. When he reached the heart of the room, Edward turned to face the assembly. His voice carried clearly, steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. He spoke of honor and of truth, of the emptiness of alliances built on ambition, and of the futility of vows made without affection. His words were not couched in metaphor, but in plain declaration. He could not, and would not, pledge his life to Lady Charlotte. The gasp that followed rippled like thunder. Charlotte stiffened, her complexion paling though her smile remained fixed with effort. She attempted to speak, to dismiss his words as a jest, but her voice faltered against the tide of whispers already surging. The Duke's hand struck the table with force, the sound reverberating through the chamber, yet even his authority could not smother the storm that Edward's declaration had unleashed. Then Edward's eyes sought Isabel. He crossed the remaining space between them with purposeful stride, his expression no longer conflicted but resolute. Before the gathered nobility he extended his hand, and when she did not move, he took hers gently, yet firmly in his own. The hall erupted, some with horror, some with astonishment, a few with breathless admiration. Isabel's breath caught as she felt his grasp, steady, unshaken, and knew in that instant that retreat was no longer possible. The crowd pressed forward, eager to witness the scandal unfolding before their eyes. Voices overlapped, some condemning, others urging restraint, all blending into a clamor that filled the chamber. Isabel stood motionless, her hand in Edward's, her heart pounding so fiercely that she scarcely heard the words he spoke next. He declared that his affection had never wavered, that it was Isabel alone he had chosen, and that he would rather forfeit rank and favor than deny his heart. The Duke's outrage broke through the noise, his voice commanding and fierce, threatening disgrace and ruin. Edward's father rose too, his expression thunderous, his authority pressed against his son's defiance. Charlotte turned sharply away, her shoulders rigid, her composure cracking at last under the weight of humiliation. The company watched, breathless, caught between fear of scandal and fascination with it. Isabel's lips parted, her body trembling beneath the enormity of the moment. She felt the force of every gaze upon her, each one waiting to see whether she would recoil or stand. Her aunt's counsel echoed in her mind. Dignity must not be surrendered. And yet, with Edward's hand enclosing hers, she understood that whatever dignity she claimed now would not be the dignity of silence, but the courage of choice. The musicians, uncertain, faltered into stillness. The room hung suspended, the tension palpable, the crowd leaning forward as if to catch every flicker of expression, every breath. And then Edward drew Isabel closer, his arm encircling her with deliberate tenderness, holding her before the assembly as though daring anyone to deny what he had declared. The hall erupted again, voices rising in shock and protest, the storm breaking fully around them. And in that tempest of outrage and scandal, Isabel felt her body waver between fear and resolve, uncertain if she would have the strength to withstand the storm that had only just begun. The uproar that followed Edward's declaration shook the hall with a force no music could drown. Gentlemen shouted over one another, ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths, and the Duke's fury broke through every murmur. Yet Edward did not release Isabel's hand. He stood unwavering, his arm shielding her, his voice steady even against the storm. He repeated, with clarity that carried above the noise, that he would not marry Lady Charlotte. The union, though praised for its grandeur, would be a hollow cage, a lie made before God and man alike. He confessed openly that his heart belonged to Isabel, that it had always been hers, and that he would endure censure, estrangement, even ruin, before he betrayed that truth. The words hung in the air like a bell's toll, impossible to ignore. Charlotte turned her face away, the composure she had displayed through the evening now fractured. Her lips trembled, though she fought to keep her posture proud. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some sympathetic, others cruel, yet all charged with shock. The Duke thundered against Edward, declaring the Ashford name dishonored, his threats promising consequences that stretched beyond the walls of that hall. Edward's father, pale with rage, refused to meet his son's eyes, his silence heavier than words. Isabel felt the ground unsteady beneath her pulse wild, yet her hand remained in Edward's. The weight of every gaze bore down upon her, but for the first time since the night of her humiliation, she did not shrink from it. She stood straight, her chin lifted, the shame that had once consumed her replaced now by a quiet defiance. Whatever judgment might come, she knew she would face it at Edward's side. The assembly, unable to contain its restless energy, broke into factions, some pressing toward the Duke with murmured support, others drawing back with wary admiration for Edward's boldness. The musicians lowered their instruments, uncertain, their silence deepening the strangeness of the scene. The supper that had been intended as triumph had collapsed into scandal. At last, Edward drew Isabel away from the center of the storm, guiding her through the throng with measured steps. Many stepped aside, whispering furiously as they passed, others glaring as though scorched by the impropriety. Lady Margaret followed close behind, her countenance unshaken, her presence a shield against the sharpest tongues. When they reached the doors, Edward paused only once to look back, not in regret, but in finality. Then he led Isabel into the night air, away from the suffocating heat of the hall. What followed came swiftly. Within days, the engagement between Edward and Charlotte was declared dissolved. The Pembrokes, incensed, spread their fury through every channel, their influence heavy upon society. Edward's father, estranged from his son, withdrew his support. Yet though the storm raged, Edward did not yield. He and Isabel were married quietly, the ceremony held in a village chapel far from London's gaze. There were no dukes in attendance, no chandeliers blazing overhead, only the solemnity of vows spoken without pretense. The countryside received them as refuge. At Edward's modest estate, ivy-clad and touched by quiet, they found what London could never offer. Their days unfolded not with glittering assemblies, but with simple walks through fields, shared hours by the hearth, and the comfort of a love no longer forced into silence. Isabel, once a figure of scandal, now discovered the serenity of belonging to a life unmeasured by society's applause. It was not without loss. The grandeur of title and the security of powerful alliances were gone, replaced by uncertainty and labor. Yet in the stillness of evenings when the sun dipped behind the hills and Edward's hand rested in hers, Isabel felt the truth of their choice. What they had claimed in defiance had become their freedom. The memory of the hall, of gasps and whispers and wrath, would not vanish quickly, but it no longer bound her. For the first time, she knew her life was her own, and her dignity had not been surrendered, but won. And as the seasons began their quiet turn, she prepared to face the world not as a figure of pity, but as a woman who had chosen with her heart and endured the cost. The chapel was small, its whitewashed walls softened by ivy and time. Morning light streamed through the narrow windows, casting pale beams across the stone floor. The pews were simple, the altar unadorned save for a single vase of fresh flowers gathered from the surrounding fields. There was no orchestra, no throng of noble guests, no blaze of chandeliers to dazzle the eye. Yet the air was heavy with stillness, with a sense of reverence more profound than any grand assembly. Isabel stood at the entrance, her hands clasped together, her gown of plain muslin falling in modest folds. A veil of fine lace softened her features, though it did not conceal the calm strength of her expression. Lady Margaret stood behind her, watchful and steady, the only family witness who had come without hesitation. Isabel's heart beat with quiet certainty. No applause would follow this union, no triumph would be declared in the drawing rooms of London, yet she knew with unshakable clarity that this was the choice her soul could honor. Edward waited at the front, his posture erect, his face solemn but unclouded. He wore no finery, only the attire of a gentleman dressed with care. His eyes, when they met hers across the length of the aisle, carried none of the torment she had seen in London. Instead, they reflected relief, devotion, and a kind of peace that came only when struggle had been endured and resolved. The minister began, his voice resonant in the stillness. He spoke of vows, of fidelity, of love that endures not through grandeur, but through trials borne together. Each word seemed to rest upon Isabel's heart with steady weight. When Edward took her hand in his grasp was firm and warm, free now of hesitation. Their voices joined in promises, spoken not for spectacle, but for truth. When at last the minister declared them husband and wife, there was no eruption of applause, only the gentle sound of birdsong drifting through the open window. Edward lifted her veil, his hand lingering at her cheek, as though he could scarcely believe she was his at last. Their first kiss as husband and wife was tender, restrained, yet it carried the depth of all they had suffered to reach this moment. Outside the chapel, the countryside stretched wide and open, untroubled by scandal or rumor. The air smelled of grass and earth, the sky spread in clear expanse. Isabel stepped into it with Edward's arm at her side, her veil stirring in the breeze. No carriage lined with gold awaited them, only a modest conveyance to bear them to the estate that would now be their home. She felt no lack. In the absence of grandeur, she discovered a fullness she had never known. The estate was modest compared with the manors she had frequented in London, yet its ivy-clad walls welcomed her with quiet grace. Rooms filled not with ostentation, but with warmth became their refuge. Evenings passed in the glow of lamplight, with Edward reading aloud while Isabel worked her needle or traced sketches in her journal. Days unfolded with walks through fields and gardens, their silence companionable, their laughter soft and unguarded. Isabel felt herself changed. The humiliation that had once threatened to destroy her now seemed distant, a shadow that no longer held power. She had faced it, endured it, and risen beyond it. The whispers of London could not reach her here, and even if they did, they would not pierce her as they once had. For she no longer lived at the mercy of society's approval. She lived in the truth of her own choice. Edward, too, seemed unburdened. The strain that had marked his features in the city had given way to calm resolve. Though he had lost the favor of family and the alliances of power, he had gained a freedom he had not dared to dream possible. He devoted himself to their shared life, not with the urgency of defiance, but with the steadiness of a man who had found his home. One evening, as they walked together through the orchard, Isabel paused beneath the branches heavy with late blossoms. The air was scented sweetly, the petals drifting like pale snow around them. She turned to Edward, her gaze lifted, her hand resting lightly in his. In his eyes she saw not the Count of London society, not the air burdened with duty, but the man who had chosen her above all. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She whispered that she had once believed her life ended in the moment of her disgrace, yet it was in truth the beginning of her freedom. Edward pressed her hand, his voice quiet, as he answered that he had once feared his chains unbreakable, yet love had given him the strength to cast them aside. They stood beneath the blossoms in silence, the evening light fading around them, their hearts bound by something stronger than titles or alliances. Isabel lifted her face toward him, and he drew her close, his lips brushing her forehead with reverence. In that tender gesture, she felt the triumph of love that had survived humiliation, defied expectation, and claimed its rightful place. And so, their story reached its close, not in the splendor of London, but in the quiet of the countryside, where truth was stronger than pretense and dignity was found in the courage to choose. Their union became more than a marriage. It was a testament that love, when steadfast, can withstand the scorn of the world. It was a reminder that the heart's true path, though difficult, is the only one worth walking. For those who looked upon their tale, the message endured, that no alliance of power, no fear of scandal, no weight of expectation is greater than the strength of love chosen freely. And that every soul, whether in gilded hall or humble field, must one day decide whether to bow to the world's demand, or to follow the quiet, unshakable call of the heart.